The kingdom began to notice what no one had yet wanted to say aloud. Not because a proclamation had been made, not because the king had stumbled, weakened, or surrendered even one visible inch of the authority that had once forced an old court to relearn the meaning of fear. He was still the same man who could silence a chamber by entering it. Still the same ruler whose gaze could make decorated ministers feel as though their robes had suddenly become too light for the bones beneath them. Still the same king who had built his reign not through softness, not through inherited ease, but through years of choosing truth where easier men would have chosen convenience and called it prudence. He was not weak, not dying, not diminished in the ordinary sense, and yet time had begun placing its hand on him. It showed first in ways only those who loved him would dare read as signs. In the damp mornings after rain, when the old injury in his shoulder tightened before the weather fully broke, and he rolled it once, almost imperceptibly, before fastening his outer robe. In the way he sat a fraction longer after court, not from uncertainty, but from the sheer accumulated weight of having held a kingdom together long enough for the kingdom to begin imagining that such holding had always come naturally to him. In the way he now let Jin carry larger portions of military review without correcting every detail, without that old instinct to step in at once and reshape the line himself. In the way Grace watched him when he thought no one saw, her eyes quiet and exact and full of the kind of love that does not flatter itself with blindness. The ministers noticed too. That was what made the season dangerous. Not openly, of course. Men who survive royal courts do not point at time and call it by name until they are certain whether the name will be rewarded or punishable. But they began glancing between father and son more often in council, began listening for the difference between delegated authority and growing transfer, began measuring not succession in theory, but succession in motion. And that was always when kingdoms became most vulnerable. Not when kings died, when everyone realized all at once that someday they would. The beauty of the season only made the truth sharper. Spring had reached Hanseong with that deceptive elegance old capitals wear best. Plum branches whitening in the side courts, pale petals slipping down against stone, too long familiar with blood and argument, thin gold light catching on tiled roofs as though the whole palace had decided, if only for a few hours each day, to remember it had once been built not merely for rule, but for endurance. The city outside the walls breathed with the uneasy steadiness of a reign that had lasted long enough to feel stable, and yet never long enough for the old factions to stop dreaming. Grace felt the shift before anyone named it. That had always been her gift, not prophecy, not sentiment, pattern. She noticed it one evening after court, when the king returned later than usual to the western chambers and set down the final memorial bundle without opening it. He did not speak immediately. He stood by the open lattice looking out over the plum courtyard where the last light had gone silver at the edges, and for one heartbeat, just one. Grace saw the years on him not as age, but as accumulation. Battle, burden, rule, fatherhood, love, history. He did not look older in any way that would make the court pity him. He looked more expensive, as if time had not diminished him, but had made clear what it had cost to remain himself this long under a throne built to grind other men into smoother shapes. Grace rose from the low table where she had been sorting copied trade notes and crossed to him without a word. He heard her. Of course he did. But he did not turn until she stood beside him. The courtyard beyond was almost empty. One lantern near the lower walk. A single attendant crossing the far edge in proper silence. Plum petals drifting slowly enough to make even stillness seem moving. "You left 3 memorials unread," Grace said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite into a smile. "I had hoped you would take longer to notice." "I have never taken long to notice when you are pretending not to be tired." That got the slightest breath of amusement from him, and then it was gone again. Grace rested one hand lightly on the window frame. The night air carried damp earth and cedar from the rain that had passed earlier in the day. Somewhere beyond the inner walls, the city bells marked the hour. The sound came soft and old, like something struck underwater. He said, without looking at her, "My shoulder was bad this morning." Grace did not answer at once, not because she was surprised, because the admission itself mattered. He was not a man who offered weakness carelessly, not to her, not to anyone. The difference with Grace was not that he confessed easily. It was that he trusted her not to turn truth into a smaller version of him. "It is the damp," she said quietly. "Yes." "And the old wound." "Yes." A pause, then lower. "And time." That was the moment the evening changed. Grace turned toward him fully. The king still did not look at her. His gaze remained on the courtyard, but she knew him too well now not to see what had shifted in the line of his face. This was not fear of dying. Men who had spent their lives near death stopped dramatizing it. This was something harder. A ruler's fear of unfinished transfer. A husband's fear of leaving work half built behind the woman who had made his life worth more than survival. A father's fear that the son he had fought to keep human might be forced too suddenly into full kingship if time chose badly. Grace understood all of it in one terrible, intimate instant. "You have begun thinking about handover," she said. He looked at her then. Really looked. There was no point pretending with her. There never had been. Yes. The answer was simple, which made it devastating. Grace felt pride and grief rise together so fast she almost hated her own body for making them indistinguishable. He saw that too. And because their marriage had long since outgrown the need for pretty lies, he said the thing most men would rather die than place so plainly between themselves and the woman they love. "I do not fear death first." Grace held his gaze and waited. He continued, "I fear leaving transition unfinished." There it was, the heart of the final saga arriving in one sentence. Not death, not loss, not even old age. Transition unfinished, the throne unstable, the sun unsealed, the old order smelling weakness in the gap between generations, and moving before the family could close ranks around the future. Grace stepped closer. Close enough now that the whole palace might as well not have existed for the space between them. Her hand rose to his face, not softly, not as comfort given to a wounded child, but with the steady pressure of a woman who knew exactly what kind of truth she was touching. "You think they are already measuring it?" "Yes." "They are." "Yes." "And Jin?" This time the king's expression altered in a way only she would ever have known how to read. Not doubt, never that. Something more painful. "He is ready in ways that frighten old men," he said, "and not ready in the ways only time finishes." Grace let out one slow breath. That was exactly right. Jin could judge, could rule, could move, could command, could already make a room of men choose caution where they would once have chosen vanity. But to become king is not only to be strong enough for the throne. It is to be placed where no one else can stand beside you in the same way again. And parents who love their sons do not reach that truth cleanly. Grace's voice softened. Then the harder task was never keeping him alive. The king's eyes darkened. "No. It was waiting until he could carry what we protected." He looked down briefly, then back at her. "Yes." The night held around them. There are moments in marriage when romance deepens past desire and becomes something almost unbearable in its clarity. This was one of those moments. No grand declaration, no youthful heat. Only the terrible beauty of being known all the way into fear and still met there with love rather than avoidance. Grace touched her forehead lightly to his. "Do you want to do it?" The answer came at once. No. It surprised neither of them. not because he wished to cling to power, because no true king ever reaches handover without losing something of himself in the necessity. He went on, but I mean to. That was why she loved him more now than at any earlier stage of their lives, not because he was strong. Strength alone becomes exhausting, because he kept choosing what was right, even when it cut directly through the parts of him he most wished to keep. Grace closed her eyes for one heartbeat, then opened them again. Then we begin. The king's hand came to the back of her neck, not possessive, anchoring. We? Grace almost smiled, despite the ache inside her. You are not handing him a throne from outside a marriage, she said. You are handing him the future we built. That landed where it should. His mouth touched her forehead once, then her temple. Then, with the old measured hunger that had somehow survived all these years of war and parenthood and statecraft without ever cheapening, her mouth. It was not a long kiss. It did not need to be. It held all the things only marriages that survive history ever fully learn to carry. Love, fear, time, gratitude, and the knowledge that two people may stand on the edge of letting go and still choose each other with the same force they once used to begin. The next day he told Jin, not in council, not before ministers, not with scribes waiting to turn the first private shape of the future into record before father and son had even fully breathed inside it. He had him come to the old military map chamber instead, the smaller one overlooking the lower eastern court, where they had spent years moving from lessons to strategy to the quieter, rarer conversations that happen only when a son becomes a man in his father's presence, and neither pretends not to notice the change. Jin arrived on time. Of course he did. He bowed first to the king, then to Grace, who was present by the king's own request and took her place near the side table rather than at the center. Again, that mattered. The transfer was political, yes, but this family had never survived by pretending politics and love were separate rooms. Jin looked from one parent to the other and understood at once that this was not an ordinary consultation. What has happened? The king did not waste his son's time with preface. What is happening, he corrected. Then, I am going to begin formal transfer. The words did not seem to strike Jin immediately, not because he had not heard them, because he heard them too well. The chamber went silent around the sentence. Grace watched her son's face. The crown prince had inherited his father's stillness and his own harder discipline layered on top of it. But no child ever truly learns how to hear this cleanly, no matter how much the throne has been preparing him for years. Honor entered his eyes first, then something almost like shock, then something heavier than either. Terror, not fear of ruling. Fear of the moment the future stops being future and becomes demand. The king continued before the silence could curdle into emotion too large to carry productively. Not abdication now, not symbolic delegation, real authority in stages. His tone remained even. Military oversight, judicial hearing authority, council leadership in my name where I do not sit, revenue review under direct seal, provincial command acknowledgement, then public steps toward eventual coronation. Jin did not speak. Grace felt the grief and pride in herself become almost physically painful. There he was, the son she had carried, the child they had fought to keep from loneliness, the man who had already bled for the next generation's first war, and now history was reaching for him with both hands. At last he said very quietly, "You have decided." The king held his gaze. "Yes." "Because you must?" The question was not accusation. Not fully. But it was not only dutiful acceptance either. The king answered him as honestly as he had answered Grace. "Yes." Jin lowered his eyes once. Only once. When he looked up again, there was something older in his face than yesterday. "I am honored," he said. And then, because this family had never truly survived by saying only the correct thing, I am also afraid. Grace nearly broke at the sound of it. The king did not. He nodded once. Good. Jin blinked. The king's mouth shifted faintly. Any man who is not afraid when he first feels the seal's full weight should never touch it. That almost saved the room. Almost. Grace came forward then, not to interrupt, to complete. She stopped between them, not dividing, only joining the line in a different shape. Pride and fear can live together, she said softly. They often must. Jin looked at her then, with the expression sons reserve only for mothers whose truth has long since ceased being optional in their lives. Grace touched his sleeve. The crown prince has been your name for years, she said. That is not the same thing as the day the kingdom begins placing the throne in your hands and looking to see whether you shake. Jin let out a small, uneven breath that was almost a laugh and almost not. I had hoped, he said, to have longer before the kingdom looked that closely. The king answered before Grace could. It already is. That was the final honesty. Not one day, not soon. Already. Which was why the handover could no longer remain private thought between husband and wife. By evening, the first stage was already in motion. A military packet arrived for Jin without secondary review. A provincial hearing request was rerouted to his seal table. 2 ministers who had once spoken too long before him suddenly grew careful in the way they arranged their arguments. Old men in the court, sensing what younger men still hoped not to name, began glancing between king and son not as theory, but as transfer embodied. By nightfall, the hidden report reached the surviving faction, not because anyone formally announced it, because old power always has ears pressed to the floorboards when succession begins moving under real feet. The report was short, coded, precise. If the transfer is sealed, the Black Rose's line becomes unbreakable. That was the spark, not the first rumor, not the first fear, the first sentence spoken by enemies who finally understood they were running out of time. And that was where the final saga begins. Not with a coronation, not with a battle, not with the old king collapsing into easy drama, but with something much stronger. A ruler feeling time's hand and choosing transition before weakness could choose it for him. A wife understanding the cost of that decision before anyone else and standing beside it anyway. A son receiving the weight of real authority with pride and terror at once. And the old surviving faction finally admitting the truth it had been avoiding for decades. If the transfer completed, the house Grace helped build would no longer be a miracle the kingdom might still undo. It would become permanent. The court began moving the moment transition became visible. Not publicly against the king. That would have been foolish. No man who had survived this reign by keeping his head attached to his neck would openly stand in the first days of transfer and say that the king had chosen wrongly, weakened too soon, or trusted the future too much. Not when the king still sat the throne with his mind intact, his authority feared, and his old habit of punishing stupidity still very much alive. No. The movement came the way old houses always move when weather changes, and they are not sure whether they will survive the season. Sideways, quietly. Like animals scenting pressure before rain. At first, it was only pattern. Ministers who had once approached Jin with careful deference now began arriving too quickly at his review tables, carrying memorials they had somehow delayed for weeks until the moment real authority started passing into his hands. Men who had kept their opinions neutral through years of uncertainty suddenly discovered admiration for the crown prince's judgment. Old families with daughters of appropriate upbringing, revived invitations, festivals, prayer ceremonies, and genealogical exchanges that had gone suspiciously dormant after the previous war. Houses that had muttered in private about Grace's influence now began speaking more sweetly of the royal family, as if affection, once profitable, had always been theirs by instinct. Grace watched all of it with the cold steadiness of a woman who had outlived too many reinventions of court sincerity to mistake adaptation for loyalty. The king watched with a different kind of stillness, one born not from surprise, but from confirmation. He had known this would happen. The moment transition became visible, not theoretical, not eventual, not hidden in private language between husband and wife, but visible. The old order would stop asking whether the future might come and begin asking how much of it could still be bought, softened, delayed, or bent. Jin felt it too. That was perhaps the cruelest part of becoming a king before actually becoming one. The room changes before the title does. Men begin speaking to the future in you before they stop trying to manipulate the living sun standing in front of them. They start offering loyalty in tones that sound too prepared. They call it support. They mean positioning. And in the middle of all of it, the crown prince was expected to remain calm enough that no one could say the weight of new authority had entered him through vanity. He did. That only made them more nervous. It started in council. A tax allocation report from the eastern districts was brought not to the king's primary desk, but to Jin's side table under the new transfer arrangement. 3 ministers watched his face while pretending to watch the paper. He read the first page, the second, and the appended flood recovery summary. Then he looked up and asked, with maddening calm, "Why is the river labor levy higher in districts already marked as under repair subsidy?" No one answered quickly enough. Jin tapped the page once. Either the subsidy was false or the levy is theft. Which one would the ministry prefer to explain first? The question landed so cleanly that even the king's chief secretary paused with his brush slightly raised. The ministers bowed. The correction was made. The room moved on. But the atmosphere did not. Because what had just happened was larger than a financial catch. The old houses had hoped that real transfer might expose some weakness in Jin. Rashness, vanity, emotional overreach, the kind of unsteady desire to prove himself that old courtiers love in heirs because it makes them easier to flatter and easier to trap. Instead, he had stepped into delegated authority the way a blade enters water, not loudly, not theatrically, just enough to show the whole room where the edge had always been. That made him worse than dangerous. It made him viable. The people outside the palace felt it too, though in a different register. Jin now heard petitions the king once heard alone. Military officers now left certain briefings saying, with care and too much respect, that the crown prince already carries the hall differently. Provincial messengers began speaking of him not only as the future king, but as the man whose seal they now feared disappointing in the present. When he rode through the lower training grounds, younger officers straightened as though the transition had already entered their bodies before law finished naming it. This was what the old houses smelled, not the king's weakness, the son's arrival. So the pressure around Hei-rin worsened at once. Not because the court could openly attack her anymore. That part of the war had already been lost too thoroughly. Her father's name had been cleared. Her position had been lawfully restored. Grace's protection around her was now strong enough that no one foolish enough to survive long in palace life would try the older methods again. No, Hei-rin became a problem in a more advanced way. Because if Jin was moving toward kingship, then the question of who might stand beside him was no longer a private emotional danger. It became a constitutional one. That was how the court chose to frame it. Not Hei-rin as criminal. That would have been absurd now. Hei-rin as unsuitable. Unsuitable for a throne in transition. Unsuitable for a reign already under pressure from old and new factions. Unsuitable because her father's history was too tangled with prior instability. Unsuitable because she had entered the palace through accusation and blood and therefore carried too much memory to serve as calming royal balance. The words were elegant. That was what made them vicious. A future king, said one widowed adviser to another in the hearing of precisely the wrong servant, must make a marriage that cools the room around him. A general's daughter from the West, a noblewoman from House Han, a foreign alliance bride from the northern frontier to secure trade and border confidence. Any woman, really, who came to the future throne without fire already attached to her name. What they meant was simpler. A woman who would not remind the court of grace. A woman who would not survive the palace by forcing it to change. A woman it could live beside without having to question itself too much. Foreign pressure returned with insulting speed. The northern envoy, who had withdrawn after the previous Next Generation scandal only because it had grown too expensive to remain visible, now revived the old offer in a more dangerous form. Not a daughter merely, a package, border easing, grain assurance, shared caravan privilege, ceremonial goodwill, the girl herself. Lady Joseon, polished and trained into stillness so exquisite it almost looked like emptiness, was moved back into ceremonial range, with the quiet confidence of men who believed transitional fear would make strategic brides newly attractive again. The court factions revived old expectations. House Han sent a devotional silk to the Queen's chapel, not addressed to Grace, but to the future peace of the next reign, a phrase so pointed it almost deserved admiration for its audacity. A ritual scholar wrote a memorandum arguing that in times of transfer, marriages formed from personal attachment often provoke unnecessary instability because the people read them emotionally rather than structurally. Two lesser ministers, thinking themselves subtle, began speaking of historically stabilizing cold marriages as if women were architecture rather than flesh. Grace heard all of it. She said little. But Sioran heard more. She had grown into the kind of royal daughter old men dread only after it is too late to keep her ornamental. She moved through women's halls, garden walks, receiving rooms, and side libraries with the ease of someone everyone still thought they understood and no one actually saw. That made her dangerous enough in ordinary times. In transition, it made her lethal. She noticed first that some ministers were not merely preparing for transfer. They were preparing to manipulate the unstable period between living king and rising king. That is a very different thing. To stop Jin from becoming king eventually would require open war, and men like these had long since learned that open war against this dynasty was a poor investment. No, what they wanted was better. They wanted him weak enough to inherit under their terms. That meant bind him early, crowd him with advisory structures, make him choose a politically cooling wife, attach military expectation to house debt, force him into enough stabilizing guidance that by the time the crown formally touched his head, the old order would already be living inside the shape of his reign. It was brilliant, which meant it had to be stopped early. Sioran began seeing it in fragments. A military attaché from the Western regiments meeting twice in 1 week with a Han cousin who had no reason to care about drill appointments. A clerk in the judicial quarter requesting duplicate wax impressions of the Crown Prince's working seal for emergency continuity practice. A ceremonial inquiry asking whether officers should bow first to the king's active authority or the Crown Prince's delegated authority in disputes where both seals might appear before final transfer. That last one made Sioran stop walking, because that was not etiquette. That was positioning for split loyalty. By the time she fully understood it, the whole court had tightened into that particular dangerous quiet it takes on when no one wants to be the first to say aloud what everyone ambitious has already begun preparing for in private. The king and Grace felt it at supper, not because anyone said anything directly to them, because silence changes when people begin planning around division. The Crown Prince arrived late from military review, still carrying the clean, cold smell of horse and open air instead of court dust. He bowed, sat, and accepted the tea Grace poured him herself. still one of the few moments in palace life no one had successfully politicized out of existence. Their daughter entered a few breaths later and took her place with the kind of easy grace people mistake for softness, until she starts speaking. For a handful of minutes, the room almost felt like family rather than dynasty. Then a sealed note arrived from the Ministry of Rights, and the feeling broke. The note asked, with all proper humility, whether during the present transfer phase, officers and senior civil officials should continue swearing primary loyalty under the king's standing seal alone, or whether supplementary verbal acknowledgement of the crown prince's delegated authority should be adopted for ceremonial clarity. The king read it once, then set it down. Jin looked at the paper, then at his father, and something dangerous passed silently between them. Grace saw it. Seorin saw it. No one else in the room needed the note explained. Ceremonial clarity. Another elegant lie. What the ministry was really asking was this: if the kingdom is forced to choose in some future crisis, whose command lives first in men's bones? That question should not have existed yet, which meant someone wanted it to exist very badly. Seorin waited until later to bring her fuller findings. She did not interrupt family supper, because one of the first lessons Grace had taught her was that timing is a blade too. She waited until the crown prince had gone to his later review chamber, until the king had dismissed the last attendant from the side court, until Grace stood alone beneath the covered outer walk, reading the night prayer docket with half her mind elsewhere. Then Seorin came beside her and said quietly, "They are building a split." Grace lowered the docket. Between whom? Seorin's face did not change. Between what men obey and what they think they obey. Grace turned fully. "Show me." Seorin led her not to the main study, but to the side archive annex where smaller things could be spoken before they became louder than the walls deserved. There, from her sleeves, sash fold, and copied memory sheets, she laid out the fragments. A private instruction asking provincial officers to clarify whether delegated command from the crown prince carried emergency force without parallel kingly notation. A training hall note requiring captains to state for private record the authority line they recognize in transitional conflict. A lower council inquiry about which seal should govern if the king and crown prince issue simultaneous directives before full coronation. A military quarter prayer list reordered so that certain officers appeared grouped not by province, but by likely loyalty channel. Grace read each one in silence. By the time the king entered, summoned by nothing more dramatic than the fact that Grace had sent for him at once, and he had heard enough in her tone to leave 2 waiting ministers standing. The room had already become one of those places where a rain changes shape. He read the papers, then read them again, then looked at Seorin. "Where did you get these?" Seorin answered with perfect stillness. "From men who still think daughters only hear embroidery." The king's mouth almost moved. Almost. But the danger in the room was too great for pride to soften into visible warmth. Jin arrived a short while later. He took one look at the table and understood. By the time he finished the 3rd sheet, the old future had died. "They do not want to stop me from becoming king," he said at last. Grace looked at him. "No." Jin's eyes went colder. "They want me weak enough to inherit under their terms." There it was, the key line of fear. The truth beneath all the court's timing, all the marriage pressure, all the sudden ceremonial anxiety about seals and verbal loyalties and transitional clarity. They did not want to stop Jin from becoming king eventually. They wanted to make him rule already shaped by the old order's hands. The king stood very still. That was always dangerous. Not because he was undecided, because he was now seeing just how far the surviving faction had already moved beneath the dignity of ordinary process. If this was allowed to mature even a little longer, the kingdom would not fracture in open rebellion. It would harden into divided obedience. And divided obedience kills dynasties more elegantly than armies ever do. Jin set the final note down with deliberate care. What do you intend to do? The king answered without looking away from the papers. Find every hand that touched this. Jin's jaw tightened. Quietly? The question was fair enough to hurt. The king looked up then. Yes. Jin said nothing more, but Grace saw the flare beneath his silence. The same old tension, sharpened now by higher stakes. The son wanting decisive clarity. The father knowing that badly timed decisiveness can hand cowards exactly the chaos they need to survive under new titles. Sioran, however, asked the more dangerous question. And if conflict comes before you finish tracing them? The room held. The king looked at his daughter with the kind of respect men in his position do not always know how to show publicly, though he had long since learned it in private. Then, he said, we make sure the kingdom knows before they do that we have already seen the split. Grace understood the deeper meaning at once. The final saga had begun to reveal its true antagonist. Not one minister, not even one faction. Transition itself. The vulnerable space between reigning seal and rising authority, where old houses, frightened officers, foreign interests, and ambitious men all begin imagining they might still insert themselves into history before history closes. It came late, past midnight. Past the hour when most of the palace pretended to sleep while the dangerous parts of it stayed fully awake. A hidden report reached the surviving faction's inner channel. Not a rumor, not guesswork. Confirmation. A courier, bribed through a dead trade route still tied to Lord Name's old coastal web, delivered one coded line into the lower chamber of a house that had not openly taken a side in years. The line read, if the transfer is sealed, the Black Rose's line becomes unbreakable. That was the spark. And in the quiet dark of Hanseong, men who had survived too long by waiting finally understood that the season of waiting was ending. And this time, not with a duel, not with a wedding, not with some smaller court intrigue dressed as grandeur, but with something much more dangerous. Old houses smelling change and moving like frightened predators, marriage politics around Jin erupting into strategic warfare, Sioran uncovering the beginnings of a dual loyalty fracture in the military and council, and the final enemy faction realizing the truth it had tried to avoid. They could no longer stop the future, only poison the handover. The pressure on Jin and Hae-rin did not return through scandal. That would have been too crude. The court had already tried scandal in younger, clumsier forms and been burned by it. It had tried accusation, quiet disappearance, emotional manipulation, and the old tricks of making women vanish behind paperwork, while men called it order. Those methods still lived, yes. Palaces never truly forget a successful cruelty. But the scale of the threat had changed now. The future throne was no longer abstract. That was the difference. Jin was no longer merely the heir the kingdom would someday have to endure. He had begun carrying active authority. He read military reports before they reached the final seal. He corrected revenue distortions without needing half the council to bless his judgment first. Provincial officers now rode to Hanseong, asking not only what the king intended, but what the crown prince had already said in the matter. In hearing halls across the capital and in market rumor far below them, people had begun using a more dangerous phrase than one day. They had begun saying, when he rules. And once a kingdom begins speaking that way, women near the future king stop being private. They become constitutional. That was the old order's terror. If Jin ascended with Hae-rin beside him, then Grace's victory would not remain bloodline alone. It would continue in queenship style, in moral center, in chosen love, in the terrifying possibility that the next reign might begin not from correction, cooling, and political compromise, but from the same kind of bond that had once changed the kingdom under his parents. That was intolerable to them. So Hiren was attacked again, but not as criminal. That part of the war had already failed too publicly to be repeated with elegance. Now she was attacked as destabilizer, as the wrong woman for a transition. The language came polished. It always does when the court wants violence to sound thoughtful. The kingdom needs calm, they said. The future king needs a politically neutral wife, they said. The old wounds tied to Hiren's father's history are too dangerous to seat near a transfer of power, they said. The transition should not be complicated by personal attachment, they said. Personal attachment. Grace heard that phrase first in the women's prayer court from the mouth of a noble widow who smiled while saying it, which was how Grace knew the sentence had already moved through 3 kitchens, 2 receiving halls, 1 ritual advisory table, and at least a dozen carefully lowered voices before reaching her ears. She did not answer the widow. She only looked at her long enough that the older woman's smile began to tremble at the edges. Personal attachment. As if Hiren were a ribbon tied carelessly around a prince's wrist, instead of a woman who had walked into court carrying the buried war of 2 decades and nearly died doing it. As if Jin's regard for her were ornamental instead of the result of shared danger, judgment, and the most dangerous thing a palace can allow 2 intelligent people to discover in one another: equality under pressure. Grace recognized the shape of the attack at once, because she had lived it. Different clothes, different generation, same knife, a woman too close to the throne, too morally vivid, too alive in the wrong place. A woman men called disruptive only because they had not chosen her and therefore did not know how to own what she made visible in them. The court's terror was not truly Hiren herself. It was what she would mean if she remained. A future king whose first great choice beside the throne came not through arrangement, but through discernment. A reign beginning in continuity with Grace rather than correction against her. That was what frightened them, not romance, inheritance of a moral style. The attack began spreading through form. A ritual scholar submitted a memorandum arguing that during active transfer phases, future queens should be selected for atmospheric calming effect and inter-house confidence, not emotional proximity to unresolved political histories. An old northern envoy revived the foreign alliance proposal with new urgency, now attaching not only trade assurances, but an offer of ceremonial military goodwill should the match be accepted before public transfer. One of the Han ministers, cautious enough to hide his appetite behind concern, proposed that all non-royal women in sustained proximity to the crown prince during transition be reviewed for stabilizing suitability. The phrase made Princess Sioran laugh once when she read it, not because anything was funny, because some kinds of filth deserve mockery before they deserve destruction. Stabilizing suitability, she said, standing in Grace's private side hall with the parchment held between 2 fingers as though it smelled bad. They talk about women the way horse traders talk about temperament. Grace took the document from her and read it slowly. Then she folded it once. Only once. They are frightened, she said. Sioran leaned one shoulder against the carved screen and watched her mother with eyes too old for her age. Yes, she said, but not of love. Grace looked up. Of repetition. That landed. Because it was true. The old order could survive one Grace if history eventually absorbed her and made her look exceptional. Singular. Strange. A once-in-a-reign disruption no one could repeat. But if the future king also chose the wrong woman in the right way, if Hiren remained and became part of the next reign, then Grace would cease to be an exception. She would become precedent. And precedent terrifies old systems more than scandal ever does. Meanwhile, Jin stepped deeper into visible rule. That only made the court's panic worse. He presided over 2 tax hearings and 1 military appeals session within the same week. In the military hearing, He overturned a border officer's disciplinary recommendation, not because he favored softness, but because he proved the officer had punished unauthorized movement in a supply line he himself had left vulnerable through late reassignment. In the tax hearing, he forced 3 ministers to publicly clarify a levy discrepancy they had hoped to smooth into next quarter's paperwork. He did not speak as a boy trying to impress the room. He spoke as a man who expected the room to withstand truth without needing flattery first. The people began seeing not only the heir, they began seeing the coming king. And because people are dangerous when they start admiring the future before the court is done formatting it, the old order grew more desperate. The first truly cutting blow reached Hayren directly. It came not through threat, not through a blade, through exclusion. A notice circulated among the ceremonial women's offices, carefully, quietly, through those channels where women's presence is sorted into respectable categories, before anyone pretends the sorting was merely domestic. The notice did not name Hayren. Again, men like these are not fools. Instead, it listed the women considered appropriate for sustained visibility during transfer rites, transition meals, public educational observances, and pre-coronation spiritual protocols. Her name was nowhere on it. Sioran found the notice first. Of course she did. She brought it to Grace before noon. Grace read the list, read it again, then set it down with the same terrifying gentleness she once used when letters about the dead had first begun speaking in the palace. That evening, she sent for Hayren, not to the public receiving chamber, not to the archive hall, to the inner plum room off the Queen's residence, where women came when the truth between them needed walls old enough to hold it without turning it into spectacle. Hayren entered already knowing something had shifted. She had grown too skilled in surviving halls and glances not to know when the atmosphere around her changed from cautious tolerance to active arrangement. She bowed properly. Grace let the form pass. Then she dismissed everyone but one outer attendant and said simply, "Sit." Hayren sat. The room was quiet except for wind moving faintly against the paper screens. A tray of tea sat untouched between them. The late light made the carved wood dark and rich and almost solemn. Grace studied her for a long moment before speaking. "They are beginning again." Hayren's face did not change much. "That was answer enough." Grace went on. "This time they will not call you criminal. That was too clumsy and they know it. They will call you destabilizing, unsuitable, inconvenient to transfer, too tied to old blood in the wrong way. They will say the future king must begin his reign from still water." A brief pause. "What they mean," Grace said softly, "is that they fear any woman who does not arrive empty enough to be filled by their design." For the first time, something moved across Hayren's face that was not only discipline, not weakness, recognition. Grace saw it and understood, with a sharpness that almost hurt, that this was not a conversation between queen and protected witness only. This was one woman who had survived becoming the wrong woman for the throne, speaking to another now standing on the same cliff edge. Hayren lowered her gaze to the untouched tea. "I knew," she said quietly, "that I would become a problem if I remained." Grace's answer came instantly. "You were a problem before you arrived. Remaining only made it visible." That almost pulled a breath of bitter amusement from Hayren. Almost. Her fingers tightened once over the fold of her sleeve. "They will say I am making it harder." Grace leaned back slightly. "Yes. And you?" The question was not insolent, not fishing, not even entirely personal. It was the question one woman asks another when the whole world has begun trying to turn her into a symbolic inconvenience, and she needs to know whether the woman before her still sees the human being beneath it. Grace answered with the truth Hayren deserved. "I think," she said, "you are standing exactly where they hoped no woman would stand again, near enough to power to matter, intact enough to choose, and inconvenient enough to remind them that the future king may not begin where they want him. Hayren looked up then. Their eyes held. Grace saw all the things the girl was trying not to say. That she had not sought the prince. That she had not come to the palace for romance. That she had come carrying her dead father's war and found herself, almost against survival's good judgment, looking at the crown prince as though something in him had made that war feel survivable in a different form. Grace knew that feeling. She had crossed countries of danger with it once. You do not owe them emptiness, Grace said. Hayren swallowed hard. And if I become the reason he bleeds politically before he even wears the full crown? The question was a knife because it was the right one. Grace did not answer sentimentally. That depends, she said, on whether what stands between you is merely feeling or truth. Silence. Deep. Necessary. At last, Hayren said, very low, I did not mean for this. Grace's voice softened, but only a little. No woman ever means for the throne to notice that she matters. That was the closest she would come to direct tenderness, and it was enough to shake the room. By the time Hayren left, something had changed. Not in public status. That would take larger battles, but an internal line. She no longer stood merely under Grace's protection. She stood inside Grace's recognition. And that is much more dangerous to old courts. The king and Grace needed a scene of their own after that, not because romance should decorate the plot, but because their marriage remained the emotional center of the saga. If the final war was only over power, the story would shrink. It had to be about something larger. Their quiet time came late at night in the old queen's chambers. The palace around them had gone hard again. Their son was moving toward visible rule. Their daughter had fallen unusually silent, the way she did when danger grew too adult to mock. The houses were repositioning. Hayren was being shaped into a constitutional threat. The old faction was no longer merely trying to survive the future. It was trying to corrupt the terms on which the future would arrive. Grace found the king seated near the low lamp table with 3 sealed reports open and unread before him. He was not working. He was listening to his own thoughts too hard. You know what this is, Grace said, standing near the outer screen. He looked up slowly. Yes. What? His face changed in that minute. Terrible way only she could read completely. The final war is not only over power. Grace waited. The king looked down once, then back at her. It is over whether the next reign begins by betraying its own heart. There it was, the whole shape of it, laid bare. Grace crossed to him. Not hurriedly, not like a younger wife running toward comfort. Like the woman who had built a life with him long enough to know the moment when truth must be met standing, not softened. She stopped beside him and placed one hand on the table between the unread reports. If they force him to begin that way, she said, then they will inherit him before the crown even touches his head. The king's gaze held hers. Yes. And if they fail? Then they lose not just the marriage question. Now he stood. No, he said. Then they lose the old kingdom. The words sat between them in the low gold of the chamber. This was what made the final saga larger than politics. A reign does not truly change when one king replaces another. It changes when the emotional architecture of power is denied to the old order and survives into the next generation intact. Grace touched his face then, the way she had in their younger wars, and their middle ones, and their wars as parents, and now, at the edge of letting go. Do not let them make him prove kingship by cutting away what made him worth raising. The king leaned into her hand just once. That was enough. The hook came through paper, not a blade, not poison, not an abduction. A forged decree began circulating in the outer provinces. At first, only one copy appeared. folded into a provincial magistrate's packet beneath grain orders and road repair notices. Then another surfaced in a military quarter near the western ridge. Then a third was intercepted by Sioran's quiet network before it reached a local temple recorder who liked copying political rumors into moral lessons for rich widows. The wording was elegant. That was what made it lethal. The decree suggested that the king had reconsidered the pace of full transfer because of emergent concerns regarding the crown prince's judgment and domestic entanglements. It implied, not directly, but with enough poisonous grace, that while the heir remained beloved and promising, the throne must act with caution where private attachment threatens to blur state discipline. The seal was almost perfect. Almost. The language was worse, because it sounded like the kind of thing frightened stability worshippers would absolutely believe. Grace read the forged decree once and felt cold move through her body in a single clean line. The king read it next, then Jin, then Surin. No one spoke immediately, because all four of them understood at once what this meant. Someone was trying to split the kingdom before the handover was even formally sealed. Not by open rebellion, by narrative. If the provinces began believing the king himself was uncertain of his son's judgment, then every transfer stage would grow vulnerable. Every delegated order, every military obedience line, every court faction waiting to see whether fear had permission to return. This was no longer simply pressure around Heirin, no longer marriage politics in the old sense. It was succession war through emotional corruption. The old order had finally made its move, and Hanseong was witnessing not a wedding, not a confession, not a smaller romantic crisis disguised as grandeur, but something much sharper. Heirin attacked not as criminal, but as the wrong woman for a kingdom in transition, Grace seeing her own old war return, in another woman's life and refusing to let that woman stand alone on the cliff edge, the king and queen understanding together that the final battle is not only about power, but about whether the next reign will begin by betraying its own heart, and a forged decree moving through the outer provinces with one goal, to make the kingdom doubt the future before the future is sealed. Now the handover itself had become the battlefield. This was where the saga stopped pretending it was still a palace story. Now it was a kingdom story, not because the court had grown louder, because it had grown more precise. The forged decree was not rumor, not a frightened provincial misunderstanding, not one ambitious clerk playing with wax and language to make himself briefly important in the wrong corridor. It was part of a coordinated transition attack. And once the king understood that, once Grace understood it, once Jin saw the shape of it laid fully out beneath the lamps of the Western Strategy Hall, there was no way back to the smaller language of court difficulty, ceremonial delay, or unfortunate household strain. The old surviving faction had chosen its final battlefield, not the throne alone, the handover. That was the brilliance of it. A direct coup against this king would fail. An open move against Jin would harden the kingdom around him. An attack against Grace now would ignite, rather than weaken the royal house. Heirin had already survived too much and stood too visibly under the queen's protection to be quietly erased again without calling attention to exactly the wrong kind of guilt. So the enemy turned to the one space all strong dynasties fear, the unstable distance between a living king and the son he is preparing to make king after him. That was where the forged decrees came from. That was why grain support had begun arriving late to districts newly assigned under Jin's delegated authority. That was why false courier chains were crossing legitimate military routes and leaving behind contradictory orders. That was why certain officers in western and northern garrisons had begun receiving private requests to clarify whether their truest duty lay with the king's present seal or the crown prince's coming authority in the event of civil confusion. That was why provincial magistrates suddenly found themselves holding three versions of the same directive and being forced to choose which future to believe. The plan was elegant. That was what made it monstrous. Not to overthrow the king in open coup, to make transfer look too unstable to continue. Then the old houses could step in as they always dreamed of doing, through concern, not rebellion. Temporary council management, revised timing, protective delay, joint oversight, emergency continuity guidance. All the smooth old phrases men use when they mean, let us hold the kingdom between generations long enough to own the shape of what comes next. The capital felt it before the ministers fully admitted it. At the lower military yard, captains began speaking in tighter circles and ceasing conversation when the wrong boots crossed the stones. In the outer markets, rumors grew contradictory enough that people stopped treating contradiction itself as accident. In the temple quarter, offerings increased at dawn, not because faith had deepened, but because fear had. Even the servants inside the palace moved differently now, carrying tea trays with that subtle second layer of caution reserved for days when the wrong sentence spoken before the wrong screen might become proof later. The king called the Western Strategy Hall before sunrise. No fanfare, no open emergency bell. He had survived too much to give panic the dignity of official sound before he understood exactly what he was striking. Grace came at once. So did Jin. Soren was already there when they arrived, because somewhere between girlhood and Dynasty, she had stopped asking whether her presence was invited and begun simply occupying the spaces where intelligence mattered most. Hayrin stood at the far side of the long table with the transport ledgers open and waited under carved stones, her face pale from too little sleep and too much knowledge, but her hand steady enough to make even the oldest officers in the room respect the kind of discipline that is forged outside comfort. The king listened first. That was one of the deepest differences between him and weaker rulers. When danger sharpened, he did not speak faster. He let the room reveal its shape before he cut into it. Sioran laid out the military split evidence. 3 courier notes intercepted in the same week. A Western captain's acknowledgement form asking whether future transition oaths would supersede current standing seal if province and capital orders diverged. One side record from the Northern Supply Bureau showing grain held back from a district newly placed under the Crown Prince's review authority, then released only after an older minister attached to Lord Nam's trade circle intervened. Hayrin added the false courier routes, old coastal chain methods adapted for inland use, precisely the kind her father had warned would reawaken once the old faction realized succession itself could be turned into leverage. Grace placed the forged decree beside the real transfer draft so the room could see not only falsification, but the intention behind it, to make uncertainty appear as though it came from the king's own hand. Jin did not sit. He stood with both hands braced on the edge of the table, eyes moving over the papers with the controlled fury of a man no longer reading plots, but recognizing what those plots were trying to do to his father's reign before his own had even begun. They are testing obedience, he said. The king's gaze remained on the map. Yes, not only in the provinces. No. Jin looked up. In the army. In the council, Shorin corrected quietly. Hayrin added, and in trade. That was the terrible completeness of it. Not one leak. A system. Split military loyalties. False courier chains. Delayed grain support. Forged state orders. Regional uncertainty weaponized just enough to make every local official begin guessing instead of trusting. And kingdoms crack first through guessing. The argument came exactly where it needed to come. Jin wanted immediate arrests. He said so without the theatrical heat lesser men mistake for conviction. Lord Nam's network had shown itself clearly enough now that waiting looked less like caution and more like gift. Seize the courier houses, lock the lower councils, pull the Western captains for direct oath renewal, publicly denounce the forged decree, and force every district to answer within the day. The king still wanted controlled, provable crushing, because he knew what happened when old factions are struck before their evidence chains are sealed fully. They scatter into innocence. They let lesser men burn first. They reappear through clerks and cousins and distant retainers 3 years later, calling the last purge excessive and the next king inexperienced. He would not give them that escape. Not yet, he said. Jin's head snapped up. Not yet? The king's voice stayed level. If I strike now in full public form, I force them into chaos before we have the complete network. And if you wait, Jin said, they deepen the split before we have the kingdom. The room tightened. Grace felt it at once. Not because this was the first time father and son had disagreed, because now the disagreement stood over the whole country, and both were right enough to kill each other's certainty. Jin went on, sharper now. They are already forcing captains to choose in shadow, already moving grain to make my delegated authority look weak, already speaking in my name and yours where neither of us have sent orders. He took one step closer to the center of the table. How much of the kingdom do you want them to test before you permit them to feel your hand? The king looked up then, not angry, not even first as father, as ruler, as much as reveals the throat without alerting the body. Jin almost laughed once from sheer disbelief. And how many provinces bleed confusion while you wait for the body to arrange itself politely? That one landed, because beneath the sharper language was the same old wound. The son who had inherited from his mother the refusal to let timing become another name for surrender, speaking now against the father who had inherited from years in kingship the knowledge that timing badly used can bury truth in the wrong grave. Grace saw them both too clearly. That was the burden of being the center of the family, and the reason the strongest part of their lives had to belong to her. She moved before the room could split cleanly. Not gently, not like a wife easing tempers or a queen smoothing male pride into a compromise soft enough to flatter everyone present. She came to stand between the old king and the future king and made both men lift their eyes to her. That alone changed the air. The guards lowered theirs. Sioran stopped moving altogether. Hadrin looked at Grace the way women look at one another. In the exact second they understand why one house survives, while others rot beautifully from the inside. If you move separately now, Grace said, voice low and clear enough that no one in the room could hide from it, the old order wins. Silence. Absolute. Not because the statement was unexpected, because it named the one fear both men were still trying to outrun through different methods. Grace turned first to Jin. You are right that this cannot be treated as rumor anymore. Then to the king. And you are right that if you strike only with outrage, men like Nam will feed lesser names to the fire and step back into history with their hands clean. She looked from one to the other. So hear me very clearly. Neither of them moved. This is no longer a question of whether the old order survives another season. Her eyes sharpened. It is a question of whether you intend to hand them the gap between you and call it strategy. That cut where it had to. Jin's jaw tightened. The king's face went stiller, which in him meant deeper feeling, not less. Grace did not soften. You, she said to Jin, cannot save the future by making the present look ungoverned. Then to the king. And you cannot protect the transfer by behaving as though the son you raised must still be used only when it is tidy enough to please older men. No one in the room breathed correctly. Grace stepped back only half a pace, enough to make the choice theirs again, not enough to let either pretend she had not just told the full truth. That was the moment everything turned, not sentimentally, strategically, emotionally, historically. The king looked at his son, Jin looked at his father, and for the first time since the transition began moving visibly, neither saw only the danger in the other's instinct. The king saw not impatience, but the necessary violence of a man who knew the future could be poisoned while everyone was still talking about proper timing. Jin saw not over-control, but the terrible discipline of a ruler who had spent his life learning that the wrong blow at the wrong hour can crown innocence on guilty men. The king spoke first. What would you do if I gave you speed? Jin answered instantly. Separate the visible network from the hidden one. The room leaned in. Explain. Jin's hand moved across the table, one sharp line over courier notes, grain holds, split oaths, and provincial signals. Publicly, he said, we crush the forged decree chain fast. Recall all duplicate orders. Demand provincial re-verification under both seals. Make confusion impossible to hide behind. His hand tapped the grain list. Quietly, you follow the delayed support routes and force the hidden houses to move before they are ready. If they think we are only closing the rumor, they will try to salvage the transfer disruption through supply and military contact. He looked up. Then you get your throat. The king did not answer immediately. That alone told the room how serious the suggestion was. At last he said, and if they strike in the gap? Jin's expression hardened. They will, which is why I lead the public suppression and you close the hidden body. There it was. Not father and child, two ruling forces. Grace felt the whole shape of the final saga change around that moment. The king nodded once, then only once. Good. The room released a breath. Not relief exactly. Recognition. The royal house had chosen itself. Not with tears, not with sentiment, with alignment. By noon, the first response was already in motion. Provincial re-verification orders went out under paired seal acknowledgement, forcing magistrates and military officers to declare which documents they held and under whose authority they had acted. Jin led the open campaign, not from a throne, but from the secondary council hall, receiving courier affirmations, summoning officers, and publicly punishing 2 falsified messenger chains so visibly that the city understood at once. The crown prince was not being shielded from transition disorder. He was standing inside it. The king moved in the opposite direction. Quietly. He sealed 3 lower courier houses without announcement, lifted 1 trade office inventory under old anti-treason authority, and sent men into the western grain corridor, not in royal colors, but in the plain riding cloaks used by the earliest years of his reign, when truth still had to move half-hidden to survive long enough to strike. Seorn became the family's knife in the interior. She handled the women's court, the lower ceremonial corridors, the hidden language between noble wives and provincial secretaries, the social arteries through which fear and strategy move long before either becomes law. Hayron read routes, houses, omitted weights, and coast-to-inland adaptations no one else in the capital could have seen fully enough to matter in time. Grace held the palace center. That was perhaps the hardest role of all. She had to keep the capital from panicking publicly while the house moved privately through war. She had to make the women's quarters breathe as though succession remained orderly, while knowing the old order had already chosen sabotage over acceptance. She had to stand beneath the king's visible calm and the crown prince's visible rising authority and ensure the palace did not treat their movement as competition. That was queenship at its highest level, not ornament, not softness, structure. By dusk, the enemy had begun to panic. That was how they made their final mistake. The first evidence came through fire, not metaphorical fire, actual. A courier line under double seal failed to arrive at the lower eastern check gate. Then 1 horse came back riderless. Then a second messenger stumbled in, burned across one side and half blind from smoke, carrying 1 phrase before collapsing. The convoy. No more. The royal seal convoy. The one carrying duplicate transfer instruments, provincial loyalty confirmations, and the first fully paired seal authorizations meant to lock the next stage of handover into motion beyond easy dispute. The enemy had struck it directly. That was the final shocking move. Not hidden rumor, not a forged note, not another elegant theft of timing. A direct attack on the transfer itself, which meant there was no more pretending now, no more saying the old order merely feared instability and wished to preserve calm, no more calling the faction dignified, cautious, or tragically overconcerned. Men who strike a royal seal convoy during transfer would rather set the kingdom on fire than watch the future complete. Jin heard the report standing at the council threshold. The king heard it entering from the side corridor. Grace saw both men turn toward the messenger at the same instant and understood with total clarity that the old order had finally stripped itself bare. The kingdom had crossed. By the time they reached the outer war court, the last light was dying, and the first confirmed details were coming in. Lantern carts overturned, 3 outriders dead, 1 sealed chest broken open, secondary duplicates scattered or burned, attackers moving under neutral road colors before splitting into warehouse routes clearly planned in advance. This was not symbolic disruption. It was transition war. The king took the field report from the captain's hand and read it once. Then he gave it to Jin. No ceremony, no speech, no permission asked aloud. Just the transfer in motion, now written in blood and fire instead of private plans. Jin looked up from the page. The king looked back. And in that one silent exchange, the whole room understood what had just happened. The next stage of this reign would not be father instructing son from above. It would be one king and one rising king standing under the same war. This saga has taken a dramatic turn, not with a battle finished, not with an enemy politely exposed in legal sequence, not with the old order still half hidden behind concern, but with something much more addictive, a coordinated succession crisis breaking open through forged orders, split loyalties, and deliberate economic sabotage, Grace forcing father and son to understand that if they moved apart, the whole dynasty would fracture at the seam. The royal house finally choosing itself as one strategic body, and the enemy revealing its final truth in fire. It would rather burn the kingdom than watch the transfer complete. Now there was no more pretending. The first real flames were visible from the eastern wall. Not the decorative lantern glow of a capital settling into night. Not kitchen fire, not a controlled signal. This was convoy fire. Thick, wrong, low at first, and then rising as oil caught where no oil should ever have been exposed long enough to breathe. By the time the third messenger reached the palace, breathless and ash-marked, the shape of the attack had become unmistakable. The royal seal convoy had not merely been disrupted, it had been studied, split, delayed at the right road bend, and then struck by men who knew exactly which chest mattered, which outrider carried duplicate authority roles, and how long confusion had to live before it began multiplying itself faster than truth could ride. That was what made it war, not heat, not blood, precision. The old order had stopped pretending it wanted only influence over transfer. Now it meant to break the handover in public sight badly enough that temporary delay could become law before dawn. The war court filled fast. The king stood over the roadmap while captains, secretaries, courier officers, and 2 soot-streaked survivors of the seal convoy knelt in a line too exhausted to arrange fear into proper ceremony. Jin entered still wearing the dark outer robe from the council hall, one sleeve marked with ink from interrupted decree review, as though history had decided not even to let him change clothes before forcing the next shape of kingship onto him. Grace was already there. Of course she was. Not seated, not waiting. Standing beside the long table with Siren on one side of her and Hayren on the other, as though the whole royal house had at last stopped trying to disguise what it truly was. Not separate strengths, sharing a surname, but a structure. The first captain reported the strike. The convoy had left under reduced lantern visibility in order to avoid making the transfer route too obvious. That had been wise under normal threat conditions. Tonight it had nearly killed them. The attackers had known the dark bend where the lower marsh road narrowed between the old shrine wall and the timber warehouse path. A cart had overturned ahead, too neatly, too quickly. No real accident. The lead rider slowed. The rear line compressed. Then the false road workers drew knives. The warehouse shadows opened, and arrows came in low from the side bank where only men who had walked the route in advance would have known to kneel. The king listened without interruption. Jin did not. How many men? The captain, still breathing hard through one side because blood had dried too heavily at his ribs, answered immediately. Enough to break a convoy, not enough to hold ground. Jin's eyes sharpened. So they were not meant to occupy. No, Your Highness. Hayren leaned over the route map. They were meant to cut, burn, scatter, and vanish into already prepared shelter. The room shifted toward her. She did not seem to notice. Or rather, she noticed, and had long since stopped allowing that to slow her. She pointed once at the map's lower turn, not toward the marsh, toward the old river warehouses. The attack only works cleanly if the surviving chest can be moved under inventory cover before second response reaches the site. One of the older captains frowned. How would they know the inner chest order? Sioran answered before Hayren could. Because someone in the lower ceremonial registry copied the convoy prep sequence 2 days ago and sent it through the marriage dowry route disguised as fabric inventory. The captain blinked. The king did not. Because of course that was how it had happened. In old kingdoms, the most devastating routes are often the ones men dismiss as domestic. Grace watched the room absorb that and knew at once what mattered most now. Not only response, not only recovery, control of meaning. If the palace panicked publicly, the city would panic. If the city panicked, old men would begin speaking of stabilization. If old men spoke long enough, the split the enemy had been trying to build between reigning and rising authority would thicken into behavior. So she stepped closer to the map and said, "No bells." Every head turned. The chief military secretary hesitated. "Your Majesty?" "No bells," Grace repeated. "Not city-wide, not palace-wide. We move under command, not alarm." The king looked at her once, only once. That was enough. "Agreed," he said, and with that one word, the center held. This was family war in full form now. The king took the field. Jin rode beside him. Grace held palace center. Sioran cut through the interior names. Hayren tracked the hidden route logic no one else in Hanseong understood in full. No one was decorative anymore. No one remained protected from relevance. The last stage had begun. The strike plan formed fast. Jin would take the eastern road line with the mobile suppression unit and cut off the warehouse exits before the scattered attackers could regroup into courier channels. The king would move with the hard core. The men who had served closest during the purge years and understood what it meant to seize not just bodies, but documents before fire and panic could turn evidence into smoke. Sioran would remain in the palace, but not idly. She would identify every ceremonial and marriage-linked paper channel that could still be moving instructions outward from inside the women's and household courts. Hayren would work from the recovered convoy lists and old warehouse tax maps to identify which storage compounds could plausibly conceal the missing seal materials without drawing immediate suspicion. Grace, hardest of all, would not ride. She would hold the palace, not because she was less fierce, because if the center collapsed while the king and Jin moved outward, the kingdom would split faster than any road battle could mend. She had to control messenger flow, suppress panic, keep official narratives aligned, prevent old widows and frightened ministers from turning corridor whispers into political weather, and make sure no second forged order rode out while the first attack still burned. She accepted that role without complaint. That was how everyone in the room knew the moment had become lethal. Grace never argued against danger. She argued only against stupidity. If she chose the center, it meant the center was now as dangerous as the field. When the king finished issuing the last hard orders and the room broke into movement, Jin remained. The others had turned. The captains were gathering. Seorin already had one clerk by the sleeve and was demanding names faster than he could bow. Hayrin had spread 3 warehouse ledgers across the side table. Still, father and son looked at one another across the map. No ceremony now, no court rhythm, only blood and rule in the same room. The king said, "You take the eastern line. You do not chase glory. You cut movement." Jin answered, "And you?" "I finished what they thought they were clever enough to begin." That should have been enough. It was not. Jin's gaze held his father's for one dangerous heartbeat longer than rank allowed and family required. Then lower, "You will not shut me out of the hard part." There it was. Not defiance, not insecurity. The son's final demand to be recognized where it mattered most. The king did not rebuke him. Instead, he stepped closer and said the thing that made the room, even in motion, feel briefly smaller. "If I meant to shut you out, you would still be in the council hall." That landed. Recognition, assignment, permission. The transition had crossed one more invisible line. Then they moved. The city beyond the palace walls did not yet know that a transfer war was underway. That gave them one last advantage. The eastern road remained dark enough to ride fast. The warehouses near the old river line still held more shadow than witness. Men still believed they could run contraband through lanes laid down for timber, oil, and grain long before realizing that tonight the road itself had become state memory. Jin rode hard, not ahead of the line like a young man hungry to be seen. At its exact front edge, like someone who knew the distinction between courage and theater too well to confuse them. His unit cut through the lower river approach, turned the side alley before the stacked tar barrels, and struck the first retreat group just as they tried to clear the old weighing yard with 2 half-burned seal chests and a dead courier horse still tangled in harness. No challenge, no warning wasted. The first man fell from saddle before he understood who had met him. The second tried to turn into the warehouse lane and found it already blocked by the prince's guard captain, who had served the family since the old nursery wars and looked grimly delighted to be doing this kind of work again. Steel flashed in low light. One chest overturned. Sealed rolls spilled. A third man ran for the counting shed, and Jin himself cut him off beneath the broken roof beam. "Who sent you?" Jin demanded. The man spat blood. Jin disarmed him with one clean twist that spoke not of rage, but training taught too long by a father who had once believed the boy might need to survive in uglier rooms than this. "Wrong answer," the guard captain murmured. The rest happened fast. No chaos for its own sake. No ornamental slaughter. Everything mattered because each body and each paper trail either closed the split or widened it. At the same time, the king struck the deeper line. His target was not the visible attackers. It was the nerve. The old warehouse compound above the river yards had not merely received the convoy strike. It had coordinated it through hidden storage ledgers, transport relays, and a secondary seal route masked beneath temple donation inventories. The men there were not flashy. That was why they were dangerous. Quartermasters, clerks, storehouse supervisors, veteran retainers who had outlived 3 administrations by never being important enough to remember until nights like this made them suddenly central. The king led the entry through the rear inventory court. He moved with the same terrible economy Grace had watched in younger years, and which time had not softened, only sharpened into something even colder, because now there was less youth in it, and more certainty. 2 guards at the side door, one down before breath. The second turned toward warning and found the warning ended in his throat. The inner counting room opened. 3 clerks reached for papers, not blades. That told the king exactly what kind of men they were. Not fighters, survivors, the worst kind. He seized the first ledger himself, not because he needed to, because sometimes a king must touch the proof of what has been done to his house with his own hand before judgment becomes clean enough to bear. Inside were route marks, duplicate seal requests, grain hold instructions, and one coded distribution line referencing deferred authority climate. The language almost made him smile. Almost. Men who build theft into state process always begin inventing softer phrases for weather. Outside, Jin's line drove the surviving riders back into the lower yard. Inside, the king's line broke the hidden record cell wide open. And at the palace center, Grace kept the kingdom from cracking. That was its own war. She stood in the midnight command hall with 2 secretaries, Seorin, 4 trusted attendants, and enough intercepted paper to drown 3 lesser dynasties. Every runner leaving the palace passed through her approval. Every official explanation to the outer ministries was shaped to hold confidence without revealing weakness. 2 old noblewomen attempted to force entry into the inner court under the excuse of concern for ceremonial continuity. Grace had them turned back so coldly that the second nearly forgot how to curtsy. A lower minister tried to circulate a panic note suggesting the king had left the palace in haste over family agitation. Grace read the line, burned it herself, and had the minister confined to his own quarters, under supervision for exhaustion of judgment. Seorin, meanwhile, did not breathe enough to call it breathing. Names came in from her network: marriage houses, courier wives, fabric inventories masking oath slips. 2 council secretaries linked through a prayer route to one of Lord Nam's distant kin offices. The more she uncovered, the clearer the shape became. This had never been only a military strike. It had always been a social one, too. A court attempt to turn structure, marriage, supply, and succession into one carefully timed suffocation. Hayren's importance peaked in the deepest part of the night. A secondary recovered ledger from the warehouse court looked at first like freight nonsense: lamp oil weights, dry grain transfer totals, 6 missing temple cloth bolts, 1 river toll discrepancy. Jin would have missed nothing essential in it, but he might have missed the last route. The king might have seen the false numbers but not the concealed habit. Hayren saw the pattern instantly. The missing convoy pieces had not been meant to remain at the warehouse. They were being rerouted through the old ritual quay beneath shrine account cover to a hill compound outside the lower eastern gate. A last fallback site from her father's notes, used years earlier for storing politically sensitive material just long enough to let official stories outrun real ones. She sent word at once. The king received it standing amid broken ledgers and blood-dark wood. He looked at the line once and knew the night was not done. He found Jin in the lower yard moments later. The son the king once held in his arms now stood amid pinned attackers and half-burned seal rolls, one side of his robe darkened with mud and another with a line of blood that was either his or someone else's. It did not matter yet. "This way is not the end," the king said. Jin did not ask twice. They rode together. That was the moment the story had been moving toward for years. Not metaphorically, actually. Father and son under one banner. The son the king once held against his chest in a palace built to devour children now rode beside him through the last open war of the reign. Not behind him. Not protected from the sharpest line. Beside him. Grace knew what that meant, before either man let themselves feel it. She felt it in the palace center when the second rider left, with the redirect order, and the third came back with no time to breathe before carrying the new route out again. She stood over the command table, one hand braced against the carved edge, and saw with the terrible clarity only mothers ever fully earn that this was the last time they would stand in this exact relationship. One reigning, one rising, both still under the same banner, before history separated their roles forever. No later victory could ever be this one again. The hill compound fell before dawn, not because the enemy was weak, because the royal house was moving as one body. The final cache contained the burned remains of one sealed chest, yes, but also the surviving authority rolls, a duplicate transition draft, military oath slips already marked for sorting loyalists by factional usefulness, and the private payment account proving which council names had funded the split in the first place. That was enough to kill the conspiracy cleanly. When the last of the armed men broke and ran, Jin pursued one far enough to stop him below the gate stones. The man turned, raised steel. Jin met him fast enough that the fight lasted less than 10 breaths. When it ended, the man lay choking in the dirt with his sword gone, and the crown prince standing over him with the hard living stillness of a man who had stopped being hypothetical. The king saw it, saw all of it. Not only the skill, the shape. This was no longer a son merely learning kingship. This was the man who would carry it. And then the cost arrived. Not death, not collapse. Something more honest. The king turned from the recovered chests and the final prisoners, and the long horizon just beginning to pale with pre-dawn gray, took one step toward the lower path, and the old injury that had been warning him for weeks finally exacted payment. His shoulder gave first, not enough to cripple him, but enough to throw the line of his balance half off. Then his breath caught in that hard inward way men of pride try to turn invisible and never fully can under the eyes of those who love them. Jin saw it instantly. So did the guard captain. So did anyone who had been alive long enough to know what it means when time finally insists on being admitted to a battlefield. The king straightened at once, too quickly. That was how Jin knew. Father. The word came out before protocol could catch it. The king's face hardened on instinct, not from denial, from habit. It is nothing. Jin came closer anyway. No one in the yard would ever have dared that if he had remained only crown prince in the older sense. But the night had changed things. The transfer war had burned away too many illusions. The son standing here was no longer merely the heir under supervision. He was the next center of the kingdom, and both men knew it whether either was ready to speak it or not. It is not nothing. The king looked at him, not angrily, with a tiredness too sharp now to hide completely. The eastern sky had begun to gray. Birdsong was not yet brave enough to start. Men moved around them with the rough quiet of exhausted victory. For one suspended second, father and son stood alone inside all of it. Then the king said the thing the entire saga had been coming toward. Come here. Jin stepped in close enough to hear without witness, though the guards knew better than to pretend they saw nothing of what mattered most. The king's voice was low. I can still stand. Jin's answer came just as low. That is not the question. For the first time in years, something like brief humor touched the older man's face. Dark, dry, almost painful. No, he said, it isn't. He drew one breath, then another. When he spoke again, the words landed like the first stone of a gate opening. The transition can no longer wait. Jin's expression changed. Honor, shock, grief, readiness he had never wanted to own too early. The king held his gaze. The future, he said, voice roughened now by battle, exhaustion, and the simple cost of saying aloud what cannot be unsaid, must arrive now. The war is ending, not with the enemy merely outmatched, not with father and son simply reconciling in theory, not with action for its own sake, but with something much stronger. The king and Jin fighting side by side beneath the same banner at last, Grace, Seorin, and Hei-Rin, each holding the war in the place, only they could hold it, The old faction breaking not because it was weak, but because the royal house finally moved as one body, and the reigning king, standing in the smoke and blood of the last war of his rule, admitting what time had already begun writing across the kingdom, the transfer could no longer wait. The future had to arrive now. By dawn, the kingdom had no more room left to pretend. The final enemy network had broken in the night. Not all at once, not neatly. Men like Lord Nam did not collapse with the dramatic convenience of lesser villains. They split, ran, burned records, shifted names, tried to disappear into the back corridors of respectability one last time. But the house they had been fighting was no longer merely surviving them. It had seen them fully. The hidden roots were known. The forged chains had been taken. The split loyalties had been named. The seal convoys had been recovered. The names behind the names had been pulled into light. And once the light in this dynasty truly settled on something, it did not often let go. The city felt it before proclamation reached it. Hanseong woke to a different kind of silence. Not peace exactly. Peace had never been simple in this kingdom, but the strange taut quiet that comes after danger has failed in public enough that everyone understands the world will not be returning to whatever version of itself existed the day before. Servants walked faster but whispered less. Officers at the lower gates stood straighter, not from fear now, but from that darker, heavier instinct men get when they sense history has turned and they had better not be caught leaning the wrong way beneath it. Noble houses delayed their morning visits. Foreign envoys suddenly discovered reasons to remain indoors until they understood which language would still be survivable by noon. Inside the palace, no one spoke of delay anymore. That word had been buried in the night with the last elegant lie. The transfer had to happen, not later, not when the room grew calmer, not when everyone felt emotionally ready, as if kingdoms ever grant families that kindness. Now, that was the price of victory. Grace prepared not for battle this time, but for letting go. And that, she discovered, was in some ways harder. It was easier to stand beneath threat with a knife hidden in a smile and call it queenship. Easier to watch for poison, false witnesses, weak roots, wrong hands near the nursery, dangerous women in ceremonial silk, frightened ministers in righteous language. Easier to become iron when there was still something immediate to protect. But this morning did not ask her to protect in that way. It asked her to release. That was a different violence entirely. Her attendants dressed her in silence, broken only by the soft rustle of layered silk and the faint click of jewelry touched a table before being lifted. She wore no war color now, no bridal red, no mourning, no hard ceremonial authority sharpened for attack. The robe chosen for her held the deep, mature elegance of a woman who had outlived every version of how the kingdom once tried to name her. Dark enough to carry memory, rich enough to carry victory, soft enough, at the throat and sleeve, to remind anyone with eyes that this reign had not been built by fear alone. In the bronze mirror, she looked not younger than her years, not older, but complete, and somehow that was what hurt. Because this day, for all its triumph, was also the day the child she once carried beneath her heart and shielded with her body and fought to keep human against the palace's oldest appetites would stop being hers in the first, simplest sense. He would become history's. That satisfaction and grief should live together in the same body was a cruelty mothers are rarely warned about in songs. Shorin entered before the last hair ornament was placed. She had changed too much in the night for anyone in the room to mistake her now for merely daughter and sister. She still wore one wrist bandaged beneath her sleeve from the abduction, and the mark on her forearm where a captor had grabbed too hard had not yet fully faded. But what had truly changed was less visible. She carried herself now with the kind of dangerous political adulthood no old house would ever again be allowed to overlook without paying for it. Grace turned in the mirror and looked at her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Grace held out her hand. Sioran crossed the room and took it at once. You should be resting, Grace said. Sioran's mouth moved by the smallest degree. You taught me years ago that rest is what happens after the kingdom stops trying to rewrite the terms. Grace almost smiled. Almost. Then the smile became something more fragile in the eyes and nowhere else. You came back to me. Sioran's fingers tightened around hers. Yes. There are sentences mothers and daughters speak only when war has passed close enough to leave the house changed. They are always smaller than the feeling underneath them. That is part of why they hurt. Grace touched Sioran's cheek. You stand differently now. Sioran looked at her steadily. So do you. That was true. In another chamber, the king prepared to stop being the only center of the kingdom. No robe could fully disguise what that meant. He dressed in the authority of reign. Yes, dark ceremonial weight, dragon work precise and restrained, sword belt set by hands too practiced to tremble. But the deeper preparation happened elsewhere, in the set of his shoulders, in the stillness that had once been singular and now had to widen just enough to let another man stand beside it without becoming shadow or threat. In the old injury that had made itself known too plainly the night before, and now sat beneath every movement like a second invisible witness. He did not permit anyone outside Grace to mention it. That also was part of kingship. But his body knew what the soul had admitted. The transition could no longer wait, because time had entered the room not as weakness, but as insistence. Jin prepared in another wing entirely. That mattered too. Not because father and son had become estranged, because the final morning of inheritance belongs to each man differently. One cannot arrive in the same chamber and leave the same way after this without reducing the cost of it into pageantry. Jin's attendants laid out the robe of transfer in silence. He dismissed 3 of them before they could finish speaking the old reassuring phrases people use around princes to make themselves feel useful in moments too large for usefulness. He stood alone for a while with his hand resting on the edge of the dressing table and looked at himself in the polished bronze, without vanity, without fear exactly, but with the kind of terrible comprehension that only arrives when destiny ceases being a story told around you and enters the room asking for your name. He would not be future king one day after this. He would become king in the eyes of heaven, court, and people. That is a different kind of loneliness. Hiren saw it when Grace sent for her before the hall bells. She entered dressed with disciplined simplicity, nothing that claimed what had not yet been granted, nothing that pretended humility where strength was required. She had survived being accused, hidden, targeted, nearly erased, restored, and then placed in the dangerous half-light beside a future reign. She had learned, perhaps faster than any woman should have to learn, that the palace is often most vicious when it has stopped being able to deny you and begun trying instead to classify you. Grace had no intention of letting classification be Hayren's ending. The meeting between them this morning did not need many words. That was how you knew it mattered. Grace dismissed everyone else, looked at the younger woman standing before her, and said, "You understand what today is?" Hayren's answer came low and clear. "Yes." For him. "Yes." "And for you?" There was a pause then. Not because Hayren did not know, because she knew too much to answer carelessly. "It is the day," she said at last, "when the world stops letting him belong only to those who love him." Grace's throat tightened so fast it almost angered her. Because yes, that was exactly right. She crossed the room and placed in Hayren's hands a folded document sealed with the king's private authority and the queen's confirming mark. Hayren looked down at it, did not open it immediately. Her face changed before she broke the seal, because she was too intelligent not to understand what such a paper might mean on a day like this. Inside was not marriage. Grace would not cheapen the future with haste. Not queenship, not yet. Something stronger. The formal removal of every legal and ceremonial obstruction that had made Hayren impossible. Her father's restored record was attached by copy. Her standing was named. Her right to remain near the coming reign under lawful royal protection was written into palace structure clearly enough that no man alive could later call her accidental, tolerated, or politically illegible. The king had not forced an immediate wedding to tie a bow on danger. He had done something wiser. He had made her lawful to the future. Hayren's hands tightened once on the paper. Grace said quietly, "No one will use transition to turn you into a stain they can wipe away later." The younger woman's eyes lifted, and for the first time since Grace had known her, something like true feeling, not discipline, not guarded gratitude, but the deeper and more dangerous thing beneath both, became visible enough to hurt. "My queen!" Grace cut her off gently. "Do not thank me for what should have been done before they ever touched your father's name. That was the whole point. Not generosity, correction, not favor, justice." Soren took her place before the hall as no longer merely princess, but recognized force inside the dynasty. Men bowed differently to her now, not because they had become wise overnight, because foolishness had recently cost others too much. The court assembled under a sky so clear it almost looked like mockery. No storm, no dark omen, no weather theatrical enough to flatter the moment into myth before it had earned it. Only cold, clean morning light on roofs, banners, armor, paper screens, and the hard old stone of a palace that had seen enough dynasties to know the difference between ceremony and irreversible change. The hall itself had been stripped of anything unnecessary. No excess musicians, no decorative fog of secondary ritual, no room for old houses to hide their nerves in ornate distraction. Today required witnesses, not ornaments. The king entered first, and for one long breath, everyone in that room was reminded that no matter what came next, this had been his reign. The reign that had survived scandal, faction, bloodline war, marriage war, the making of an heir, the protection of that heir's soul, the attack on the marriage, the growing of the family, the first next generation war, and now the final transfer itself. He carried all of that not as burden visible enough to invite pity, but as gravity. Grace entered beside him, not behind, never that. The hall saw at once what old fear had always been trying to phrase around her and never fully managed, that the woman who entered Hanseong once as rumor had become inseparable from the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. Then Jin entered, and this was the moment. Not because he had never looked princely before, because now the room had no more future tense left to hide inside. Every gaze felt it. He did not come in as the man they would someday need to imagine on the throne. He came in as the man the throne was already bending toward. The same stillness, the same hard-earned intelligence, the same refusal to wear power like theater. Yet there was something else in him this morning, too. Something grief-shaped almost. Not weakness. The understanding that inheritance is also severance. That a man may be honored and wounded by the same hour. Grace saw it and loved him almost unbearably for still walking straight under it. The rites began. Ancestral witness, seal witness, court witness, provincial witness. The line of transfer named in language old enough to make even the most cynical ministers uncomfortable when it was spoken properly. The recovered proofs of the broken faction entered into the record first. Not because the king needed to humiliate the defeated one final time, but because he meant the new reign to begin with memory intact, not with a lie politely buried beneath pageantry. That mattered, because thrones rot fastest when they inherit silence. When the question of Hyren's place arose, it was not raised as petition. That would have given the old houses one final chance to posture. The king raised it himself, not by naming her queen, not yet, not lazily, not romantically, by naming truth. He restored Yoon Se-jin again into the public hearing of the court as loyal investigator wrongly erased. He declared Hiren's lawful standing before the throne and the kingdom. He stated plainly that no accusation tied to her father's work or her own arrival would stand as impediment to her continued presence near the coming reign. He removed in one controlled sweep every barrier that had once made her impossible. It was stronger than a rushed wedding could ever have been, because it did not use marriage to rescue her. It made rescue unnecessary. The old houses had to swallow it whole. Some nearly choked. Princess Seorin watched them do it with the kind of expression younger daughters in stories are rarely allowed to have often enough. Intelligent satisfaction sharpened by memory and just enough restraint to keep it from becoming childish. Then came the transfer. This should have felt like ceremony. It did not. It felt like culmination. The king stood with the seal before him, the throne behind him, the court before him, Grace to one side, not supporting him because he was weak, but standing where she had always stood when truth changed shape in the kingdom, near enough to witness, near enough to sanctify, near enough to hurt. For Grace, this was not just political triumph. It was the day the child she once held became history's possession. Prince Jin came forward. For one suspended moment, the whole hall disappeared for her, not literally, in the way memory sometimes rushes all its strongest images through a woman at once and asks her to survive standing upright inside them. His first cry, his tiny fists, the nights of fear, the nursery corridors, the hidden nurses, the lessons. The first time he asked whether future kings must love less. The first time she saw him return from war, no longer boy enough to be only son. The way his face had changed the night his father told him the transfer could no longer wait. All of it lived beneath this one walk. The king lifted the seal. The room held its breath. When he spoke, his voice carried not the polished grandeur lesser rulers love in legacy moments, but the kind of clean authority only truth can sustain. "I do not give you a perfect kingdom," he said. Jin's eyes did not waver. The king continued, "I give you a kingdom no longer ruled by fear at its center." That line struck through the entire saga at once, because that was the real inheritance. Not land, not title, not even victory. A kingdom no longer governed by fear. He placed the seal into Jin's hands. No man in the room could later say he had not seen the exact second the future arrived. Prince Jin did not shake. That mattered. Not because fear was absent, because fear had been mastered enough to carry weight rather than deny it. Then, because the moment demanded something more human than pageantry alone, Jin bowed, not as subject merely, not even as son alone, as the man receiving a kingdom from the father who had once held it between chaos and change long enough for this day to become possible. Grace watched both of them and understood with a force almost too large for the body that this was what motherhood at its farthest edge feels like. To stand still while the life you guarded moves beyond your hands and into the keeping of history. The court bowed, the bells sounded, the formal transfer lines entered the record. The dynasty did not crack, it held. That was the victory. Not just a throne changing hands, a house surviving the handover without sacrificing the thing that had made it worth inheriting. Afterward, when the greater rituals had passed, and the court had been dismissed in measured waves, and the people outside had begun shouting the new truth into the city's winter bright air, Grace did not go first to the public terraces. She found the king. Of course she did. He stood in the plum courtyard where so much of their life had turned. The branches were not in full bloom now, only the first hints of it, enough to make the place feel faithful to itself, enough to make memory hurt in the right proportion. He was no longer in the same royal position he had held for most of her life with him. That was visible even in the way he stood, not less, changed. And Grace, coming to stand beside him, felt at once that they had crossed something no victory before this had asked of them. For a while they said nothing. They had earned the silence. Then Grace said softly, "We kept him alive long enough to lose him properly." The words sat between them like truth too old to be pretty. The king looked toward the far court where, under the outer lantern light, Jin now stood in the new gravity of kingship with Hyrene not at his side as ornament, but near enough to the future that no one could mistake her for temporary. Seorin stood a little apart, watchful, already carrying herself like a woman who could see the next era before other people admitted it was there. Then the king answered, "No." Grace turned her head slightly toward him. He was still looking outward. "We kept him alive long enough to become what they feared." That was the whole saga landing in one line. Not because they wanted a cruel son, because they had wanted a free one, a king who could inherit power without being inherited by fear. Grace felt her throat tighten. Not with sadness exactly, not even first, with the terrible grandeur of completion. Below them, the new light around Jin was already changing the way people moved. Even the air around him felt different now. Not because he had become a stranger, because he had become what history does to the beloved when it finally claims them for public time. Hayren stood near, not consumed by future, not reduced by it. Seorin watched with the dry, bright intelligence of a woman who would never again be left outside the shape of the dynasty's meaning. And beside Grace stood the man with whom all of this had begun, not untouched, not unchanged, but still himself, still loved, still the only person in the world who could stand beside her at the end of such a day and understand exactly how victory can ache. This was not just about a throne. It was a legacy. The Black Rose of Hanseong had entered the kingdom once as rumor. Now she stood within a living house, built from chosen loyalty, sharpened by truth, sanctified by love, and made durable enough that every old order still alive in Joseon could only do one thing in its presence: fear the future. If you enjoy this story, please like, share with friends and loved ones.